Well, hello, American federal government. Welcome to Chapter 1. Again, different textbook this year. This is what your textbook looks like. Got the ISBN and the syllabus. You can obtain it from the bookstore if you haven't done so yet. You need to do so. The first chapter was American Government Roots, Context, and Culture. And by the roots, it's like, how did we become a country? And the United States is pretty distinct in that way. Our national motto is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. And in that way, historically, we developed already as a multicultural society. So we have many different ethnicities and religions, and then we created one republic with just one requirement, and that is allegiance to the Constitution and allegiance to this idea of self-government, which is a pretty cool thing. There are those that sometimes like to associate being American with being white or with being Christian. We see that more and more lately with something called Christian nationalism, but it's simply not true. The country's always been founded upon religious freedom, and that the government does not endorse or is not part of any one particular religion. And in fact, in the Constitution, nowhere in here does it mention anything about God or religion, because that's how you maintain freedom of religion, is by keeping the government out of the religion. So that history, when it says roots, context, and culture, is important, because when it talks about the roots of it, of course, the Spanish had come first, and they were Catholic, and there were wars over religion in Europe, and then later the Puritans had come, and the Puritans actually had tried to create a theocracy, a religious society, and ultimately that is not what prevailed, because of people like Anne Hutchinson, who believed strongly that each person should be able to interpret the Bible for themselves and be free to choose their conscience. She ultimately was banished from Puritan society, and in some ways she was really an early feminist too, because she was challenging the male patriarchy, the authority there in Plymouth. But the point being is that over time, our roots and our culture would become one of multicultural. So the first part of the book gives some history background, which you should get from your history class as well. So you should be familiar with some of that if you've taken history already. But then the next part talks about the functions of American government. And that is part of your assignment this week, because I want you to take a look at the preamble of the Constitution, because this Constitution is, well, it's chapter 2, we're going to go over it, and that preamble is the function of government. What is the purpose? What is it supposed to do? And there's 5 things, and I want you to come up with an example, not in the book, not from the book, but your own example on how government fulfills those things today. So the rest of the chapter talks about how the American people and their culture has changed over time. We've become even more multicultural, more multi-ethnic, more multi-religious. But the genius of this system is it's been able to accommodate for that. Now, of course, historically, as you know, many different groups were discriminated against, disenfranchised, they kept from voting, and in fact even enslaved. Only after the Civil War did that even begin to change, but it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that you see more widespread change on that. The other thing is, towards the end of the chapter, it talks about political reform and realities. How are things really? One of the things you see is it talks about Donald Trump and how he had tapped in to great distrust of government. So one of the things you've seen recently in the book kind of is alluding to some of the threats that our democracy faces today. And one of the big threats of that is this distrust. And in some ways, this distrust began with Vietnam because the government had lied to the American public about our involvement in Vietnam. And then Watergate as well, because Nixon had been corrupt and had been using his office to try to maintain his power and go after people. That's it in a nutshell. And so that had led to distrust, and that distrust just continued until this very day. And what we see is more and more political leaders that use that distrust to try to advance their own power by saying, "Oh, the government's against you," and then it taps into conspiracy theories, and we're going to get to that later in this course, I promise you, because those tend to be really dangerous. Now a healthy distrust and just being informed about the government, yeah, that's good. But a conspiratorial distrust of government actually undermines the pinnings of government, because one of the things that is necessary for a functioning democracy is people's belief in it, that this government can function and that government can work to serve the people, which is its purpose, because that's what government does, especially when it is, the first three words of the Constitution, we the people. So government's not this far off, abstract idea led by kidnapping pedophiles who are trying to take away guns and rights and all that. It's important to come back to the fact that no, government is us. We are the people. We elect our representatives and our senators who work for us, and if you don't like what they're doing, then get off your butt, get out there and campaign for someone else. That's how the system works. But when we have our own leaders that are sowing this distrust, it sows division, and everybody's kind of getting their own information, and a lot of it's false, and people are encouraged to go after each other, and there's less of a unifying effect and a more of a divisive effect. And that's been a really sad development lately, and as I mentioned in the introduction, it really is even a threat to our democracy if we can't turn some of these things around. So that's what you're going to be learning about in this chapter. The next chapter, you'll be learning about the Constitution, and I'm going to have another video to talk about that.